Elizabeth embodied the British nation's continuity and unity for over 70 years. I remember her as a friend of France, a kind-hearted queen who has left a lasting impression on her country and her century. We also know, Lester, the Eiffel Tower will go dark tonight in honor of Queen Elizabeth. The mayor of Paris has released that. And then just one more statement. Of course, a leader, a Commonwealth leader, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, has said it is with the heaviest of hearts that we learned of the passing of Canada's longest reigning sovereign, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She was a constant presence in our lives, and her service to Canadians will forever remain an important part of our country's history. Lester, we are seeing these heartfelt condolences. Many of these leaders, of course, met with the Queen over her reign. We know that Pope Francis met with Queen Elizabeth in Rome in 2014. So these are people who had spent time with her, who knew her. They aren't just sending condolences to a family that they had no kind of personal interaction with. I think a lot of leaders, even young ones like Justin Trudeau, of course, felt a tremendous, not just loyalty, but tremendous fondness for the Queen, of course. We also heard, as Kristen Welker mentioned earlier, we've heard from President Biden, we've heard from former U.S. presidents as well. But I think these kinds of condolences, of course, these kinds of statements will be rolling in all night, Lester.
Yeah, it's, as you've been speaking, we've been rolling this montage of her with various world leaders, and it goes on and on and on. Molly, thank you. Let me bring back Wilfred Frost. Wilfred, I was curious what was going through your mind as we were watching citizens bring flowers and lay them there against the fence at Windsor Castle.
Well, absolutely, Lester. We've seen so many of these images, whether it's at Windsor or outside Buckingham Palace behind Keir and all across the country. And I think what we're witnessing as those members of the public are grieving and leaving flowers is her common touch, is the way that she managed to connect with people. We know that from the many examples of when she was at public engagements and people would speak afterwards about how she engaged with them. But all of these people laying flowers have not met her, and yet they still feel that connection to her. And I'm drawn, Lester, to a line, the opening line in a statement that's been emailed to me by Tony Blair that says, we've lost not just our monarch, but the matriarch of our nation. She was this motherly figure that everybody, whether they'd ever come across her in person or not, was able to feel a connection with. Tony Blair, of course, was one of her longest serving prime ministers for 10 years of her 15 prime ministers. And I think there's another aspect to this, not just the connection that everybody feels to her, but a sense of gratitude as well, because everyone feels she delivered for the nation. And I'm just so happy that she was able to witness that gratitude at her Jubilee earlier this summer. Of all those moments when we wanted to see her on the balcony, perhaps more important was the chance she had to see her people waving, smiling and celebrating and saying thank you to her earlier this summer. And I think that's a similar sentiment that's now being witnessed in a different way as they lay flowers and grieve her, but at the same time thank her.
Yeah, how do you frame this moment? Like all countries, England, the United Kingdom went through the COVID crisis, the depth of the COVID crisis, now going through a financial crisis. There has been a political change of leadership, and now the death of a queen. That's a lot.
Oh, it's an awful lot, and I think the thing to strike, actually, most importantly here, Lester, is this crisis that you mentioned, the economic crisis or the war in Ukraine as well. That's down to the head of government, and I think it's important that she was here to make sure there was a smooth handover of the head of government. That power now rests in Liz Truss's hands. Extraordinary weight on her shoulders. A terrible inbox just 2 days ago that has now gotten even tougher to deal with 2 days into her premiership. But that was important, that she was here for that handover of power, that it went as smoothly as it did. Though what we now lack as a nation, what we now miss, is our head of state. state and that unifying factor that she provided to help us get through the challenges. And that aspect of it now falls, of course, on King Charles III. It remains to be seen the scale with which he can step up to the mark, and it'll be interesting. But I think we've already got a glimpse of his commitment to that duty, as we said earlier, that he'll be down in London tomorrow and indeed deliver remarks as king. But an extraordinary 48 hours, Lester. You cannot overstate that we've witnessed the change of government and now the change of head of state as well.
Yeah, you could argue this is an early and an unforeseen test for a new prime minister. She spoke to the nation tonight. What are your thoughts about her message?
I thought it was remarkable, in fact, and emphasized the quality of her public speaking. Some would say that she came across as slightly robotic, and I think she stepped up to the mark incredibly well. She was brief, to the point, and prime ministerial, as she needed to be, and spoke of the fact that the Queen reigned with dignity and grace for 70 years, that she was the rock on which modern Britain was built. And I think the most striking part of her speech were the final couple of lines where she reflected on the fact that earlier this week the Queen was determined to carry out her duties when she appointed me as Prime Minister. She reminded the nation of perhaps the most important part of the Queen's reign, her commitment to duty, and linked it back to herself. So I think at a very early stage of her leadership, a massive test thrown at her feet, and she stepped up to the mark. The bigger tests are to come, both relating to this issue and issues of government, and we will see her tested. But I think Keir was absolutely right to make that comparison to the way in which very early in Tony Blair's leadership, he had to step up to the mark and capture the mood of a nation as we reflected on the loss of Princess Diana, and this an even bigger challenge for today's Prime Minister, just 2 days into her premiership.
Yeah, just remarkable. Wilfred, thank you. Also with us again, NBC's Molly Hunter. Molly, you're going to look at her loss in through a different kind of a lens that we don't often talk about.
That's right. In more of a celebratory lens, which I know feels hard, I think, at this moment, perhaps, to think about. This country is absolutely in mourning, still in shock, even, as I think Wilf had said before. But we did take a look, Lester, at the Queen as kind of the most recognizable face, the most recognizable woman in the world. Take a quick look.
The Queen's image was recognizable around the world. A pop cultural icon.
The Queen has been depicted in popular culture more than any other person, really, because she is a global icon. She is immediately recognizable anywhere and everywhere in the world, and because she's been around for such a long time.
At a glance, Queen Elizabeth was known for her handbags, her pearls, her eye-catching bright colors. Some say her outfits reflected her belief that she had to be seen to be believed. Artists took inspiration from her likeness, and while shows and movies about the royals took off,
I don't often get into a fight, but when I do, I want to win.
The Queen herself wasn't necessarily a loyal fan.
We know that some members of the royal family watched The Crown and other dramatisations of the monarchy. There's never been any suggestion that the Queen herself watched it. You know, if you're born into the royal family, hundreds of thousands of pages of script and drama will be written about you, whether you like it or not.
And to those who knew her best, she had a very different side, less formal perhaps than the reserved leader we all saw.
I always wonder whether anyone properly captured her sense of humour.
There is a knife into my foot. I know there is.
She exceeds the throne when she's just 25, and over the course of subsequent decades, not only proves herself to be one of the world's most experienced ambassadors, but equally probably one of Britain's most stalwart, if the most stalwart public servant that's ever lived.
England's longest-serving monarch, her dedication to service defined the royal family, adored at home and admired by fans around the world. Molly Hunter, NBC News, London.
Yeah, Molly, we had heard earlier that she was a fan of technology and an early adopter of her time, and that story certainly reminding us of her contributions to pop culture in many ways.
Absolutely. Her contributions, whether willingly or unwillingly, consciously or unconsciously. I think that is why we are seeing, the statements from around the world. That is why we are seeing Paris, turn off the lights on the Eiffel Tower. Why we are seeing the crowds right now push themselves up against the fences at Buckingham Palace, because everyone felt like they knew her, Lester. People feel like the Queen belongs to them because she was in all of these films, because she was in The Crown. And even though she wasn't necessarily a fan of The Crown, we all watched The Crown and felt like we had learned about her life through this, fictional, although based on real events. We watched movies about her at all stages of the last 70 years. And what I like about this, in that piece, we mentioned her sense of humor that we didn't necessarily see publicly. We saw this stoic, stalwart, a very stable leader. But apparently, according to those who knew her best and were closest to her, she did have a sense of humor. And we saw her, Lester, in 2012 when the Olympics were here. We saw her alongside Daniel Craig's James Bond character, which was quite fun. We saw her just now in the Platinum Jubilee. We saw her acting alongside Paddington Bear. So she certainly had that kind of light touch when she wanted to. She certainly just picked and chose her moments. But as everyone has said, she has written about fiction and nonfiction. She is in so many movies, so many TV shows, and so many of us around the world, fell in love with the Queen because of this, because of these fictionalized dramatizations of her life, Lester.
Yeah, Molly, thank you. Let's bring in NBC News British historian Andrew Roberts again. And Andrew, if we can pick up on what some of Molly was saying, for a lot of people in the UK tonight, do they feel that they've lost part of their national identity? When you think about how people, outside your country think of Great Britain, they think.
They do. Of course they do feel that, despite the fact that this lady was 96. It still comes as a bit of a shock that she wasn't immortal in a way. But also they do recognise that this story, this long story, this 1,000-year long story of the British monarchy is a series of chapters, and one chapter has closed today, but other chapters will open, and we can look forward to the reigns of King Charles III, of course, and then King William V, and then King George VII. And that's quite a thing. That will take us through to the whole of the rest of this century, to the end of the 21st century, and we can see the way that that's going to progress. So there is a cloud over us, but there is one with a silver lining, and that is the continuity of the institution.
We have some pictures, apparently we've received now, of Prince Harry arriving at Balmoral this evening without Meghan Markle, we should note. Andrew, is he in a, we have all watched the strain in that relationship between the brothers, between over the decision to leave the UK. Is that going to be under a lot of the microscope now as we watch this family move through a private grieving process in a public way?
I'm afraid it will be, yes. It's the inevitable fact that there is a story there, undoubtedly, but also I'm afraid it's a story that the media loves, that they will do everything in their power to poke their nose into, and perhaps even to stoke up, frankly. And so I'm afraid that we're going to see, just as we did a bit with Prince Philip's funeral, that this great state occasion is going to be slightly muscled into by people who are watching the body language of these two brothers.
I'm looking at a dizzying chart of the family and the family line here. Some of the titles are going to be changing. Will some of the duties and the roles, will others be called upon to step up in places they haven't been before within the family?
Yes. Well, obviously, at the beginning, the first thing that happens is that the Prince William will at some stage become Prince of Wales. That's very much up to his father to decide when that happens. He automatically becomes the Duke of Cornwall, which gives him the Cornwall estates, the large estates that belong to the Duchy of Cornwall, which are now his, automatically by right through a 13th century Act of Parliament. And then after that, it's expected that Prince Charles is going to slim down the royal family in that the royal status will be kept, but the amount of jobs and places and sinecures and so on will be redistributed. That happens automatically, really, at the death of the monarch. Anyhow, and Prince Charles has got some pretty radical plans for that, it's said.
Well, this family lives under a budget, does it not? And does some of that go to drive the direction that the new king takes it?
Well, and a lot depends on what's going to happen to the budget, because you have to have a fairly large budget with a fairly large family of people working in it. However, if we've already, of course, lost Prince Harry and the Duchess of Sussex to California, which in itself led to a redistribution of roles and jobs and honours, and so we're going to have another one now as Prince Charles works out who he wants to represent the royal family and frankly who he doesn't.
All right, let me turn to Daisy now. Daisy, what have you learned? What do we know about the first few days now of the official mourning?
Well, these operations, as they're known, are put in place not just months or years in advance, or decades in advance. But of course, the best laid plans can be changed at the last minute. So whatever I'm about to say to you, Lester, may well change. The royal family could, of course, change their minds. But we know that the Queen's body will be taken to Holyrood, which is the official residence in Scotland, where she is at the moment. We know that books of condolence will be opened all over the country. We know that her coffin will be then transported on the royal train from Scotland down to London. Now, traditionally, when that's happened in the past, the train tracks, at the side of the train tracks, have been surrounded by people throwing flowers. And you'll remember probably the way that Diana's car journey had people lining the streets throwing flowers. So we may well see that with the train. In fact, I'm told that the plan is that there would be a second train behind the royal train to pick up all the flowers and clear the lines. Then she will get to London. Of course, the other thing, tomorrow, King Charles will officially be proclaimed as king. Now, he is king now. There isn't an interregnum at the moment, but he will have this procession tomorrow, this performance tomorrow. Well, that will happen with the Privy Council. We would expect to hear a speech from King Charles as well. And then her body will lie in state at Westminster Hall within the Palace of Westminster. That's the oldest bit of the Palace of Westminster. Now, in the past, when that's happened, 4 senior members of the family almost stand guard at the 4 corners of the coffin. It's considered a very, very intimate part of the mourning process. And the thoughts are that would be the Queen's 4 children. So that would be Edward, Andrew, Anne and Charles. Now, obviously, we haven't had official confirmation that that's the case, but that's what many people are expecting. And then, of course, the build-up to the actual state funeral, which will be a huge event.
Daisy, thank you for that. And we take that note of caution that it may change as we progress here. Let's bring in NBC News royal contributor Susanna Lipscomb. Susanna, if we could talk about Prince William for a moment and, his perhaps growing responsibilities, growing footprint now in a world without the Queen. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose he comes into the limelight even more, as you say, because he's now the heir apparent. He's moved up the ranks. And so now that we have a king Charles III, who has come to the throne in his 70s, the prospect of William's own reign comes closer. Of course, there's a chance that King Charles, it's going to take a while to adjust to saying that, will live as long as his mother, not reign obviously, but live as long as his mother. But of course, he's taking over in his 70s, a big job. And so we may well see in the next decade or two, William becoming king in his turn. And so I think what we'll see in the coming years is a real focus of growing William into that role, that he will step up and that we will see him far more representing the country, even more than he has done. I think they will come absolutely into the limelight. And we saw that starting, of course, at the Platinum Jubilee. We saw the focus on that line of succession, the Queen standing next to Charles and William and to William's children. And so that you had a sense that we could see the three generations of the royal family ahead. The royal family were very deliberate in the choice of who we saw at the Platinum Jubilee to make this point. But we're only going to see that more and more over the coming months and years, so that we start to build a trust in William as a future king as well.
I wonder if there'll be signals, if we'll get hints or clues as we watch the family progress publicly now through what's to come over the next few weeks.
Yes, because it's all a sort of reordering, isn't it, really? I mean, we now have, everybody has a different position in line to the throne, and we all know this from our own personal family tragedies. When grandmothers die, the next generation comes up to the fore. But here it has constitutional effect. And so I suspect over the coming days, we will see the clear signalling of the royal family to indicate to us the future. And we'll see where people get lined up in importance. Whether Charles's siblings continue to have such a visible role is a question we need to answer. And of course, we already know whether the Duke and Duchess of Sussex will have. They won't so much. So the focus is very much going to be on that line of succession.
All right, Susanna, thank you for your analysis. Let me bring back Keir Simmons, our correspondent outside Buckingham Palace. And Keir, we've been watching the images where you are, also various other places where people are leaving now their flowers and making their statements of honorarium. What are you seeing where you are?
Well, Lester, what we're seeing are people flooding into the streets here at Buckingham Palace. There aren't residential addresses here, not close, so people will have made the effort to come here even in the rain. And that means that the hundreds, perhaps thousands, but certainly hundreds of people who are outside, it's hard to see because it's dark, outside Buckingham Palace, they've made a special effort in difficult weather because, of course, they want to pay their respects. What we will see in the days ahead, Lester, are similar scenes. There are different plans for the death of the Queen, depending on where she died, and because she has died in Scotland, she will first be moved in Scotland, and then in time her body will be brought by train back here to London. She will then lie in state here in London, and I suspect if you cast your mind back, for example, to the death of the Queen Mother, who also lay in state, what you saw there were lines, we call them here queues, of course, lines of people waiting for hours to simply walk past and pay homage to her. Well, this is Queen Elizabeth. I think you can expect to see that and some, frankly. If these crowds here are any indication of the way that people feel, and I suspect they are, then I think you'll see that in the days ahead, because there will be days of mourning before their state funeral, before dignitaries from around the world come to pay their respects. Ordinary folks are going to get to pay their respects, and I suspect what you'll see too is people, ordinary, me and you, ordinary people, just folks on the street, coming here from around the world simply to be able to spend that moment with a queen who has devoted so much of her life. And then I think what you're going to see is a split screen, actually. You're going to see that public mourning and the public pomp and ceremony taking place, because it is a funeral, but it equally will have all of those aspects that surround the British sovereign. I think you'll see that, and this split screen at the same time you'll see the private mourning of the royal family. And we have learned that Prince Harry now has arrived at Balmoral. So there are so many things happening behind closed doors, Leicester, that we can only imagine, but that we can picture. And William and Harry together at Balmoral, the place where the Queen consoled them after the death of their mom, together again there for the death of their grandmother. These are private family moments, but anyone who has experienced the death of a loved one, an elderly loved one, will know how the dynamics of a family shift and how families come together and are united. And we hope, don't we, that that's what's happening right now for the royal family.
Yeah, Keir, a couple of things have struck me. One of them is the simple statement in which the news was delivered. A couple of lines, the letter, affixed to the gates where you are there at Windsor, at Balmoral, for something of such magnitude, such a simple declaration.
Yeah, that's the way they do things at Buckingham Palace. Few words, but powerful words. This is history. This is history happening, and so I think for the royal family, it's a private moment, but there is also all of the public side which they are going to be part of. And for Prince Charles, as you've been mentioning, now King Charles, he is having to shoulder the burden of that responsibility at the same time as mourning the death of his mother.
Keir Simmons, thank you. Let me bring back Wilfred Frost for some closing thoughts as we near the end of our coverage here. This news first breaking, as you recall, around lunchtime, your time, with word that the Queen's health had taken a turn, the doctors being concerned, and then that very brief message we saw a bit later on announcing her death. Is it hard to know the journey this country now is embarking on?
I think it is, Lester, and look, this is an incredibly, profoundly sad day for the nation. There's no two ways about that. But as we've been listening to these tributes, I do pause and reflect and wonder that as much as we've all suspended our rational thought in recent years and hoped that Her Majesty would live forever, this day was inevitably going to come at some point, and I wonder whether it has come at the least bad possible time. She got us through the pandemic. She was able to enjoy her Jubilee celebration and witness the joy that she brought so many people and the gratitude that they had for her. And then right till the end, she was able to get probably the sense of self-worth that she would get from knowing that she delivered on her duty once again by appointing a new Prime Minister. And now she goes off to heaven to be with her husband, her strength and stay. And it's a terribly, profoundly sad day. But in that regard, there are some positive, and she will be remembered with enormous gratitude by a nation. And may she rest in peace.
Wilfred, well said. Thank you. With the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, a 70-year chapter of history comes to a close, and a new chapter has now begun with the reign of King Charles III. There will be 10 days now of ceremony signifying the end of one era and the beginning of another. We'll cover all of it for you in the days ahead. That concludes our coverage. We'll have much more tonight on NBC Nightly News. For all of us here at NBC News, I'm Lester Holt in New York. Good day.
Good evening, you're watching Sky News on a momentous day for the nation. Her Majesty the Queen passed away at Balmoral this afternoon, just 2 days after she appointed the new Prime Minister, her 15th Prime Minister.
Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her.
A sombre evening for the country and indeed the world as the monarch's death is marked at the royal palaces. The royal family together to support the Queen in her final hours, flying to Scotland to be with her. And a nation in shock and mourning, unbelieving of the news of the death of the woman who has reigned over all of our lives. Good evening. It's a moment unlike any other in the last 70 years. The passing of a monarch unlike any other. Her Majesty the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, died this afternoon at the age of 96. It was at her beloved home, the Palace of Balmoral, and was, Buckingham Palace said, peaceful. Her son is now King Charles III, and he said tonight that his mother's death would be felt throughout the Commonwealth. Well, we'll hear the tributes to Her Majesty tonight, so many of those, and look back at her long and simply quite incredible life. Well, with our first report tonight, Jason Farrell reports on the day the Queen died, and that marked the end of an era.
At some point today, nearly everyone will have stopped what they were doing and absorbed the news. A notice was placed at Buckingham Palace. Flags were lowered. Our longest serving monarch is gone. Only on Tuesday did she look robust, appointing the 15th Prime Minister to serve during her reign. In a statement, His Majesty the King said, "The death of my beloved mother, Her Majesty the Queen, is a moment of the greatest sadness for me and all members of my family. We mourn profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign and a much-loved mother. I know her loss will be deeply felt throughout the country, the realms and the Commonwealth, and by countless people around the world. During this period of mourning and change, my family and I will be comforted and sustained by our knowledge of the respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held."
We are all devastated by the news that we have just heard from Balmoral. The death of Her Majesty the Queen is a huge shock to the nation and to the world. Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her. She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation. Through thick and thin, Queen Elizabeth II provided us with the stability and the strength that we needed. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure.
Today we mourn the passing of a remarkable sovereign. It is a deep private loss for the royal family, and our first thoughts are with them at this time. The nation shares in their grief.